Mercer, at the age of 78, embarks on one final journey to fulfill a promise he made to his fallen comrades decades ago. What begins as a trip with a mysterious box and a letter gradually unfolds into the revelation of a classified military operation and a return to a past that never truly let him go. His path leads to unexpected recognition, deep reconciliation, and the honoring of fallen heroes. This is a story about memory, duty, dignity, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Welcome to my channel. I was 78 when the call of unfinished business stirred something deep in my bones, something older than pain, more persistent than memory. My name's Eli Mercer. Most folks around the town of Cedar Rock just called me Old Eli. Lived alone on the edge of the East Texas pines, where the cicadas never stop singing, and time feels like it took one look at the place and decided to keep driving. You see, I wasn't one for town gossip or Friday night gatherings. I kept to myself. Always have. There's a rhythm to solitude that most folks misunderstand. It's not loneliness, it's clarity. My hands, gnarled and calloused, were stained by the years, still bearing the echoes of every wrench turned and every acre worked. My knees ached like hell in the morning, but I never gave them the satisfaction of slowing me down. I drove a 1964 Dodge D100 pickup, faded red, rust crawling up the wheel wells like ivy on a gravestone. Kids used to call it the war wagon. They'd watch it roll down Main Street every Tuesday and Friday, engine coughing smoke, tailpipe rattling like a death rattle. The way they'd point and laugh, they didn't know, couldn't have. That truck had seen more than most men. Same stops, same routine. Groceries, some tobacco, coffee beans. Always cash, always exact. People would wave. I'd tip my cap. Never more than that. Not because I was rude, just careful. Words are like bullets. Best to make 'em count. But that Tuesday night, just as the sun folded itself beneath the pines and cast the road in molten amber, I did something I hadn't done in over 40 years. I broke routine. Inside that worn-out home of mine, I unlatched an old cedar box I hadn't touched since the Ford administration. From the closet, beneath an army blanket and a pair of boots I hadn't worn since Nam, I pulled out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Hands trembling more than usual, I placed it gently inside the box and fastened the brass lock. Then came the letter. I'd written it 3 days earlier. Took me 2 hours. Cursive handwriting don't come easy anymore. My hand shakes too much. But I got it done. Just one line on the envelope. Precinct 9, delivered to duty desk. No exceptions. That box and that letter, they were a promise. A decades-old one I had no right to keep putting off. That night, I placed both items on the passenger seat of the war wagon, turned the key, and listened as the engine woke up like an old dog startled from a nap. 43 miles to Barrage County. No radio. No companion. Just the howl of tires on asphalt and the ticking of the dash clock like a metronome counting down the last act of some old play. At the county line, I hit something strange. 2 patrol cruisers. Lights flashing. A checkpoint set up across the 2-lane stretch of Route 17. Unusual? Sure. But the world had changed, and I'd long since stopped questioning what passed for normal anymore. A young officer flagged me down. 25, maybe. Barely old enough to rent a car. License and registration, please, he said, voice steady but a little too crisp, like he was still practicing authority. I handed him what he asked for. My license was worn and fading, same as me. He looked it over and gave me the kind of once-over you reserve for suspicious packages and drunk uncles. What's the reason for your trip tonight, Mr. Mercer? Police business, I answered, calm as ever. He frowned. What kind of police business? The kind that don't need explaining, I said. Just need delivering. That didn't sit right with him. I saw his hand twitch toward his belt. You mind if I take a look in the truck? I placed my hand on the cedar box, just resting there, nothing threatening. What's in the truck isn't yours to look at, son. It's for Precinct 9, and no one else. His lips tightened. He didn't like that answer. A moment later, he stepped back and called in backup. Within minutes, I was surrounded. Lights painted the trees red and blue. 3 cruisers now. I could see shapes shifting in the brush, silhouettes of young men who hadn't yet learned that not all threats were a villain's face. Step out of the vehicle, sir, the lead officer said. I looked at him. Really looked. He had good eyes. Honest, maybe. Nervous too. Still green. I won't resist, I told him. But I won't apologize either. He didn't know what to make of that. None of them did. They put cuffs on me, gentle, as far as that kind of thing goes. I let him. Didn't say a word as they took the box and the letter from my truck. I'd kept a promise longer than some of those boys had been alive, and I'd be damned if I'd let their suspicion be the end of it. The ride to the Barrage County precinct wasn't long, but it felt like crossing decades. I sat in the back of the cruiser, hands cuffed in front, the kind of courtesy they extend to folks who aren't drunk, dangerous, or doped up. I could feel the stares from the front seat officers through the rear view. They didn't say much. Maybe they were wondering what kind of threat a 78-year-old man in overalls could possibly pose. Didn't matter. I wasn't thinking about me. I was thinking about that box. They'd stowed it in the evidence compartment. No idea what it was or what it meant. To them, it was just a relic an old man was too protective of, maybe something worth investigating, maybe not. But I knew better. I'd carried it with me through fire, fog, and the long silence that comes after war. When we got to the station, I was processed like any other detainee. Fingerprinted, photographed. The young tech at the desk asked me to remove my cap. I hesitated. Reflex, really. That cap had shadows sewn into it. But I did as asked. It was when they took my fingerprints that something shifted. A soft alert tone pinged from the computer. The officer handling the system, slim fellow with a new badge and nervous fingers, looked confused. Captain, he called. You might want to take a look at this. I heard murmuring. A supervisor, stern-faced, stepped over. He stared at the monitor, then at me. He didn't say a word, just walked back into his office and picked up the phone. I didn't need to hear what he was saying. I already knew. The flag had been raised. A very old flag. Not the kind you wave over parades, but the kind buried in redacted files and whispered between generals. I sat quietly on the holding bench, hands on my knees. The room bustled with the usual low hum of a police station, phones ringing, keys clacking, someone bringing in a guy with a black eye and breath that could ignite jet fuel. No one paid me much attention. But Captain Boone did. He stepped out of his office after a while, eyes locked on me. He had a look that wasn't suspicion anymore. It was curiosity. Maybe respect. He walked over and waved for me to follow. You're not under arrest, he said, unlocking the cuffs. But I need a few answers. Come with me. His office was clean, organized, and smelled faintly of lemon polish. Pictures of his family lined the shelf, a boy in a football jersey, a little girl holding a violin, a woman with kind eyes who probably reminded him how to breathe when the badge got too heavy. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. I sat. We opened the box, he said without preamble. Had to. Standard protocol. I didn't say a word. Just looked at him. There's a medallion inside. Not like any I've seen. Looks military. High-ranking. Some kind of serial on it. Encrypted. Still, I said nothing. He leaned forward. You want to tell me what Echo 9 actually is? That caught me off guard, but only for a heartbeat. I believe the name you're looking for, I said quietly, is Sentinel Echo. He blinked. That confirmed what he suspected, that I wasn't just some backwoods grandpa with a grudge. Never heard of it, he said. But the Department of Defense has. Because when we scanned the emblem, we got a call. What kind of call? The kind that doesn't go to my desk. The kind that gets routed through 7 switchboards and ends with somebody telling me not to ask questions I won't like the answers to. I nodded. I'd expected that. They're sending someone, he added. ETA, 45 minutes. Told us not to touch the box again. And to keep you in one piece. Reasonable, I said. He sat back, rubbed his jaw. Mind telling me why a civilian police precinct is in the middle of whatever this is? I considered him. Boone seemed like a good man. Sharp. Disciplined. Not arrogant. He deserved an answer. It's about protocol, I said. Silver trace doctrine. When certain items are recovered, especially those tied to covert field units, the first handoff goes to local authorities. Civilian jurisdiction. It prevents internal tampering. That's not in any manual I've read. It wouldn't be. He leaned back, exhaled. You're not just a vet, are you? No, Captain, I said. I'm what's left when the uniform fades and the noise stops. He didn't press further. Outside the office, I could hear the volume rising. Officers whispering. Someone mentioned DoD clearance, another said joint operations. It was starting to spread, the awareness that something strange was unfolding, something bigger than a routine stop. The cedar box sat between us on the captain's desk. Its brass lock shined faintly in the light, and even unopened, it seemed to hum with weight. Inside, the emblem I'd protected for nearly 5 decades sat nestled in black velvet. A promise forged in blood, silence, and fire. I didn't know who was coming through that door in 45 minutes, but I knew why, and I was finally ready to hand it over. They always show up quiet. No sirens. No horns. Just a stillness that rolls in like fog and settles deep in your bones. At exactly 11:57 p.m., the first of the black SUVs turned onto the street outside Barrage County Precinct. I knew they were coming before the dispatch radio even crackled. Old instinct. You learn to feel the presence of certain kinds of men before they step into view. 3 SUVs. Then 5. Then 6. Matte black. No plates. Military markings so subtle they might as well have been tattoos on a ghost. Captain Boone stood beside me in the conference room, jaw tight, arms crossed. I've seen DEA raids. ATF. Even a Homeland Response team once, he murmured. But this isn't them, I said. This is deeper. The officers watching the security monitors started shifting uncomfortably. Some stood. Some sat straighter. Boone's desk sergeant leaned in and whispered, "Sir, that's Joint Special Operations Command insignia on their collars." Boone looked at me, his voice low. "What the hell did you bring me into, Mr. Mercer?" "I told you," I said. "A promise." The front doors opened. 3 figures walked in, 2 flanking the center like sentinels. The one in the middle moved with slow, deliberate steps. Tall, silver hair, crisp uniform with 3 stars gleaming on the shoulder. His nameplate read, General Thaddeus Cromwell. He walked like a man who'd spent his life dragging the weight of secrets behind him. When he saw me, he didn't smile. He stopped, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a formal salute. "Commander Elias Mercer," he said. "United States Army, retired." "It is an honor, sir." I hadn't heard that title in nearly half a century. Still felt strange. I returned the salute slowly, my arm stiffer than it once was. "The honor's mutual, General. But I ain't been commander in a long, long time." He stepped forward and lowered his voice. "Some titles don't fade, Commander. They just wait." Boone looked like he was watching history breathe in real time. The general turned to him. "Captain Boone, thank you for your cooperation. This matter is now under direct military jurisdiction. If we could use your largest secure room, we'll begin the formal debrief." Boone didn't argue. He just nodded and gestured toward the back. The conference room was converted in less than 5 minutes. Maps were unrolled. Files marked, eyes only stamped with decades-old seals were laid out. The cedar box sat at the head of the table like a sacred object. Around it, 6 military officials, a pair of analysts, and the general himself formed a circle. I sat at the end, silent, watching. Cromwell opened the box and lifted the emblem with both hands. It was no ordinary medallion. Oval-shaped, black steel core rimmed in aged silver. The center bore a phoenix etched into a 7-pointed star, one wing broken. Along the edges, a sequence of numbers and letters. Code-locked. Biometric signature embedded in the frame. It was the last original insignia of Sentinel Echo, a ghost unit from a war we never officially fought. This emblem, Cromwell said, addressing the room, was thought lost during Operation Smoke Veil in 1974. The last survivor of that mission disappeared without a trace following the collapse of Firebase Greyline. He turned to me. "But you weren't lost, were you, Commander?" "No," I said softly. "I walked out, but not before burying 11 of my men under the roots of that mountain." Silence. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Boone had entered the room now, standing near the door, watching like a man who knows he's in a moment bigger than himself. "Sentinel Echo was a recon unit," the general continued. "But not just recon. We were tasked with asymmetrical denial missions, deep field extractions, counter-shadow ops, black box containment. Stuff even Langley pretended didn't exist." "The box," I said. "It wasn't about medals. It was about memory. About names." Cromwell nodded. "Inside this emblem is a microfilm. Names. Mission data. Tactical telemetry. Intel that's never been declassified. Until last month." "Silver Trace protocols," I said. "Activated 3 weeks ago," Cromwell replied. "Your son, Colonel Jacob Mercer, filed the request shortly before he died in a covert action in eastern Syria. His documentation included one final instruction. He produced a second document, handwritten. He asked us to honor his father's last mission." I felt something hollow crack open in my chest. Jacob, my boy. He'd known. Carried it, just like I had. I hadn't seen him in years. His career had taken him all over the world, places where even mail couldn't reach. But somehow, even without words, he'd understood the weight I bore. He always said, Cromwell continued, that promises don't die with time. They wait. For men like you to finish what history tried to forget. I nodded. Slow. I told them I'd bring it home. Every last one of them. And when I walked out of that jungle, I didn't bring bodies. Just this. I looked down at the emblem, and a name carved into my heart for each one left behind. The lights in the precinct's conference room felt colder now. Not because someone had touched the thermostat, but because of what the room had become. It wasn't a police station anymore. It was a witness stand. A reckoning. General Cromwell turned the medallion in his hand slowly. The silver caught the overhead glare just enough to remind everyone that they weren't holding a piece of memorabilia. This was a vault. A key. A confession of things the country never told its own sons. There were 17 of you, correct? He asked. No, I replied. There were 24. But only 17 made it out of the chopper that night. Even the analysts, those younger suits in the back of the room, paused their typing. No record of 24, one muttered. There wouldn't be, I said. Half of them were ghost operatives. Burnt files. No birth certificates, no funerals. But you remember them, Cromwell said. I looked him square in the eye. I remember every damn one. He nodded slowly. Would you be willing to confirm the names, for the record? I leaned forward. Not for them. For the ones who never got to finish their letters. For the ones whose names were only ever whispered in the dark by men who couldn't sleep. Sergeant Raphael Ortiz. Recon. Played harmonica better than he shot, and that's saying something. Died pulling 2 rookies out of a fire tunnel. Private Jonas Taggart. Rifleman. Never stopped smiling. Got hit during extraction, still asked if I needed help patching up the others. Specialist Bertie McGrath. Real name was Emily. First woman they led in the program. Tougher than all of us combined. She stayed behind to delay the enemy. Never made it out. I went on. One by one. Each name hung in the room like a prayer nobody knew how to say out loud. Captain Boone, God bless him, stood motionless near the door, his hat now held respectfully over his chest. The officers who had doubted me earlier were gathered outside the glass. Not watching a detainee anymore. Watching something holy. Cromwell listened like he'd been waiting his whole life to hear these names spoken aloud. When I finished, he stepped forward and carefully placed the emblem back in its velvet case. Commander Mercer, he said, his voice thick now. I've attended hundreds of ceremonies. Folded flags. Letters to widows. God knows how many hollow speeches. But this is the most complete act of duty I've ever seen. I didn't respond. Didn't need to. Your son, he added softly, never told you he'd filed the activation for Silver Trace? I shook my head. Jacob and I, we were from 2 different eras. Same uniform, different wars. I thought I'd buried this for good. Well, Cromwell said with something like awe, he must have known you'd see it through. Because he told the Pentagon, and I quote, my father never leaves unfinished business. Not in war, not in life. My throat tightened. I hadn't cried in years. But hearing my son speak through a piece of paper like that, across oceans and beyond the grave, it hit different. Like he'd been marching beside me this whole time, one step behind, carrying my silence. A sudden knock interrupted the moment. It was Officer Shaw, the same kid who'd handcuffed me at the checkpoint. He entered cautiously, clearly uneasy but resolute. Sir, he said, addressing me now, not the general. I owe you an apology. You did your job, I replied. I'd have done the same. No, he said, stepping closer. I've read about men like you. My grandfather was infantry. Always said real warriors don't brag. I treated you like a suspect. I should have recognized something was different. I reached out, clapped him gently on the shoulder. It's not about recognition, son. It's about seeing past the noise. One day, you'll know the difference. Cromwell stepped forward. We're transporting you to Fort Belden for final ceremony and transfer. Honors will be rendered. The president has already been briefed. He wants you in D.C. by morning. I'll drive, I said, nodding toward the precinct window. Cromwell blinked. Drive? My truck, I said. It's made it this far. It deserves to finish the ride. Boone chuckled under his breath. That old war wagon? I smiled. That truck's got more scars than I do. And every one of them earned. Cromwell nodded. We'll arrange an escort. Military and police. No need, I replied. I've gone most of the way alone. Let me finish it that way. He paused, then gave the smallest smile. Understood. I stood, picked up the cedar box. It felt lighter somehow. Not because its contents had changed, but because the weight of silence had finally lifted. After all these years, someone else knew. Not the whole story. That would take lifetimes. But enough. The sky was just starting to shift from black to that bruised purple color that comes before dawn as I walked out of the Barrage County precinct for what I hoped would be the last time. The world outside was hushed, like it, too, was holding its breath. A dozen officers stood along the walkway, lined up in silence, not by order, but by something deeper. Respect, maybe. Or maybe just the realization that they'd nearly written off a man carrying history in his glove box. I nodded to them as I passed. No words. Just the kind of looks exchanged between folks who've seen something they didn't expect and can't quite forget. There she was, parked right where I left her, my '64 Dodge D100. The war wagon. She looked even older now, bathed in the station's sodium light. Her paint, once cherry red, had faded to the color of dried blood. Dents along the side like old battlefield scars. She'd outlived men, seasons, storms, and 2 transmissions. But she never once left me stranded. I opened the passenger door and placed the cedar box gently on the seat. Buckled it in. "Let's go home," I muttered. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I spotted Captain Boone by the steps, arms crossed. He wasn't trying to stop me, just watching, like a man witnessing the end of a chapter. "Need directions?" he called. I gave him a thin smile. "I've been driving this road longer than most folks have been alive." He smirked. "Safe travels, Commander." With that, I turned the key. The war wagon coughed, then roared to life. Same way it always did. Like an old hound dog who hears the hunt one last time. I eased her onto the county road and pointed her north. Toward Fort Belden. Toward the final handoff. The night air was crisp. Pine trees lined the road like old sentries. Every few miles, the headlights would catch a pair of eyes, deer, maybe, or just ghosts from the past checking in. I kept my window cracked and the radio off. The only soundtrack I needed was the engine and the steady rattle of tools behind the seat. The roads were empty at that hour. Just me and the long silence. But about 20 minutes in, I saw the first signs. A handmade poster on the side of the highway. "Thank you, Eli." Another a few miles later, held by a woman and her son on an overpass. Promises kept. Never forgotten. Somebody had talked. Maybe Boone. Maybe the general. Maybe just the wind carrying word faster than I ever could. Either way, the news had spread. And people had shown up. By the time I crossed into Lancaster County, there were whole clusters of folks at gas stations, waving little flags, clapping as I passed. Kids with signs. Veterans in ball caps. Old men with tears they didn't try to hide. They didn't know the full story. But they knew enough. And that was more than I'd ever expected. At one point, just outside Winslow, a sheriff's cruiser pulled alongside me, lights flashing. I tensed. Old reflex. But the deputy rolled down his window and gave me a 2-finger salute. "Escort, sir," he called over the wind. I shook my head. "Appreciate it. But I got this." He nodded once, then dropped back, falling into a quiet tail position behind me for the next 10 miles. Never said another word. Just rode along like a ghost rider in the dark, before peeling off with a final nod. The rest of the drive passed like a dream I didn't dare wake from. When I finally saw the lights of Fort Belden crest the ridge, something inside me stirred. Not nerves. Not dread. Just wait. The gate was already open. Waiting. I hadn't seen the gates of Fort Belden in over 40 years. Used to be, I'd come through them wearing a uniform, heart full of orders and mud on my boots. This time, I came through in a battered truck, bearing the weight of the men who never made it back. The guard at the checkpoint stepped out before I even reached him. He was stiff-backed, squared away, probably no older than 22. But when he saw the emblem on the dash and recognized the convoy trailing quietly behind me, a single black SUV from the Joint Command, he snapped to attention and saluted. "Welcome home, Commander Mercer." I nodded. Didn't say a word. Some moments are bigger than language. They waved me through. Inside, things had changed. The old barracks were gone, replaced by sleek buildings with glass fronts and buzz-card doors. But the main quad? That was still there. Same concrete paths. Same wind carving past the flagpoles. Same weight in the air. They directed me to the honor hall. Inside, under the soft yellow light of recessed bulbs, I saw something I never thought I'd see, a podium with my name on it. Not for an award. For a ceremony. A corporal came up, nervous, respectful. "They're ready when you are, sir." I looked down at the box still buckled in the passenger seat. Took a breath. Reached for it. My hands didn't shake. When I stepped inside the briefing hall, it wasn't what I expected. No big crowd. No media. Just rows of brass. Quiet. Waiting. And in the front row, the families. Wives, sons, daughters. Some with graying hair. Some barely older than toddlers back when their fathers had vanished. They didn't know my face, but they recognized the box. I walked it up, placed it gently on the stand. This belonged to them, I said. I just carried it. No one spoke, but I saw it in their eyes, the knowing, the release. One by one, names were read, and as each name echoed through the hall, a family member stood to receive a folded flag, a citation, and something no medal could match: remembrance. I stayed standing until the last name. Then I saluted. That's when the general came forward. He took the box from the stand, held it high, not like a prize, but like something sacred. "Commander Elias Mercer," he said, "on behalf of the United States Army and the nation, mission accomplished." They offered me a ride back home in a polished black government SUV, complete with tinted windows and a driver who probably knew 6 ways to kill a man with a pen. I politely declined. "My truck's still running," I said. "She's got one last leg in her." The general smiled and didn't argue. He just handed me something small, a brass tag on a thin chain. On it, etched in deep lettering, "Sentinel Echo, no one forgotten." I closed my hand around it and gave a slow nod. Outside Fort Belden, something unexpected waited. Lined up along the road were civilians, men, women, children, many in coats and caps, holding flags. Quiet, respectful, like they'd come to witness not a parade, but a man finishing something worth finishing. No cameras, no loudspeakers, just the sound of wind and boots shuffling on pavement. One boy stood right near the edge of the crowd, maybe 10 years old, holding a cardboard sign in both hands. "Thank you for keeping the promise." I don't know how he knew. Maybe someone told him. Or maybe kids like that just understand. I tipped my cap. The drive home was slower. Not because of the truck, but because I wasn't in a hurry anymore. I passed the same roads, the same gas stations, the same crooked mile markers, but everything looked a little different now. Like the world had noticed I was carrying something heavier than groceries this time. When I pulled back into Cedar Rock, I expected quiet. What I got instead was a row of patrol cars lined up just outside the edge of town. Officers at attention, not for inspection, for me. One of them stepped forward, Deputy Shaw, the same one who had cuffed me 2 nights ago. He raised a salute. I returned it, then eased the war wagon forward. No red carpet, no speeches, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was this: the silence wasn't suspicious anymore. It was reverent. My house sat quiet as ever on the edge of the woods, just a slouching roof, tired porch steps, and a swing that hadn't moved since the last big windstorm. I backed the truck into its spot under the old pine, killed the engine, and let the silence settle. For the first time in years, it didn't feel heavy. Inside, the house still smelled like old cedar, coffee, and dust. I set the box down on the table, now empty except for the chain around my neck and the folded note from Jacob, still tucked in my coat pocket. I poured a mug of coffee, sat down in my favorite chair by the window. It was then I heard it, a soft knock. I opened the door expecting a neighbor, maybe the local pastor come to offer words. Instead, I saw a small group. A dozen people, more arriving down the gravel path. Not townsfolk. Families. Some carried photographs. Some clutched letters with yellowing edges. A woman stepped forward and said quietly, "You knew my brother, didn't you? Samuel Cross. He was one of yours." I nodded, not trusting my voice just yet. She handed me a picture. Sam in uniform, grinning like a fool. He used to whistle when he was nervous. I said before I could stop myself. Could whistle a hymn in a firefight. She smiled through tears. That sounds like him. Others followed. By the afternoon, my home had turned into something else entirely. Not a museum, not a shrine, but a living place for memory. They told me stories I hadn't heard. I told them ones they'd never been allowed to know. Together, we remembered men the world had tried to forget. When the last guest left that evening, the sun was sinking low. I stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, and watched as the wind picked up through the trees. A promise had been delivered. A burden had been set down. And for the first time in decades, I felt something I hadn't in so long I'd forgotten the shape of it. Peace. A few days passed. The headlines moved on, as they always do. Some news outlets called it a forgotten hero's return. Others romanticized it, used words like legend and mystery. I didn't bother reading most of them. They weren't wrong, just late. But Cedar Rock? Cedar Rock remembered. On a quiet Sunday morning, I found something new inside the truck. Just above the glove box, screwed neatly into the dash, was a small brass plaque. Simple. Clean. Elias Mercer. Keeper of promises, 47 years. No note. No signature. But I knew who had done it. Likely Boone. Or Shaw. Or maybe one of the young bucks from Fort Belden who'd felt the weight of what I'd carried. I ran my fingers over it. The brass was warm from the sun. Later that week, a reporter caught me outside the feed store. She was young, nervous, polite. Asked for just a quick word. "What's it feel like?" she said. "To finally have people know your story?" I thought about that a long second. "Recognition's fine," I said. "But it's not why good men do hard things. We do them because they're right. Whether anyone's watching or not." She scribbled that down like it was gold. Maybe to her it was. I gave her a polite nod, tipped my cap, and climbed back into the war wagon. When I pulled out onto Main Street, I noticed something else. The kids, those same kids who used to point and laugh at the rust and smoke, weren't laughing anymore. They just stood and watched. One of them even saluted. That old truck had become something else now. It was a story, a symbol, and not just of me, but of the men whose names I carried in that box. The ones who never got to come home. Spring settled gently over Cedar Rock that year. Not with fanfare, just a quiet warmth, the kind that loosens the soil and coaxes green from gray. I kept mostly to my routine. Coffee by the window. Runs to town in the war wagon. Nothing fancy. But now, folks stop me more often. Just to say thanks. To shake my hand. To ask questions about men they'd never met. From wars they'd only heard about in passing. Some asked if I'd speak at the high school. Others wondered if I'd write a book. I always smiled, shook my head. "The story's been told," I'd say. "Not mine anymore. It belongs to them." I didn't need a podium or a publisher. I'd done what I set out to do. What mattered was the silence had broken. And through that crack, sunlight was pouring in. One afternoon, about a month later, a government envelope arrived in the mailbox. Heavy stock, gold-embossed seal. I opened it slow, like it might explode. Inside was a formal invitation. The White House. Presidential Commendation Ceremony. In recognition of Sentinel Echo Unit and Commander Elias Mercer. I didn't go. Not out of pride. Not protest. I'd stood on enough stages. Worn enough brass. I didn't need applause. And neither did the men I left behind. Instead, I walked into the woods behind my house, where the pines grow tall and thick and the wind has a way of saying things most people never hear. There, beneath the oldest tree on my property, I buried a second cedar box. Not the original, that was housed in Fort Belden's archives now, but a handmade replica. Inside were copies of the names, letters from the families, a photo of Jacob in uniform, and one last folded note, written in my own trembling hand. To those who walked with me and never came back, you were never forgotten. I carried you every mile. I marked the spot with a small stone and nothing more. A memorial not for crowds, but for memory itself. As the sun began to set, I walked back to the truck. The war wagon caught the last light of the day on her worn fenders, the brass plaque glinting once as I climbed in. She started on the first try. I didn't know how many more miles she had left in her. But we'd come this far together. She deserved to go the distance. I pulled onto the road and drove slow, the kind of slow that lets the past catch up to you without having to chase it anymore. And somewhere between the edge of town and the next dirt turnoff, I realized something. The mission wasn't just about returning something. It was about remembering. It was about keeping something alive, not with flags or medals, but with action. Quiet, steady, unseen by most. The kind of action that defines a man more than his uniform ever could. I may not wear the title anymore, but that promise was the last command I ever followed, and I carried it home.